and welcome to the Stochastic Pigeon podcast, an interview series where I, Robin Leverton, am talking to artists and thinkers about their practice and technology. Joining me today is Lia Mice, a multidisciplinary artist, experimental electronic music producer, and designer of large-scale digital musical instruments. Mice holds a Master's of Music in Creative Practice from Goldsmiths University and has recently completed a PhD in Media and Arts Technology at Queen Mary. So welcome, Lia, or should I call you Dr. Mice?
Oh, yeah, you can call me either.
Good. So I was first introduced to you and your work at the V&A Digital Design Weekend in 2022, where you were presenting Chaos Bells. And then we got talking in the pub afterwards about how traditional musical instruments aren't designed with any form of accessibility in mind. Could you highlight for myself and people who aren't familiar necessarily with musical instruments or design what some of those concerns were and how you've kind of addressed them or put them into Chaos Bells?
Yeah, so I was first kind of brought up to speed with this by the OMI Trust. So that's OHMI, One-Handed Musical Instrument Trust. Mm-hmm. That's an organisation and a charity whose goal is to make every two-handed instrument a one-handed version for that. So essentially, they have flagged that a lot of orchestral instruments can only be played with two hands. And that isn't very accessible for people with upper limb disabilities, people with, varying dexterity, and so on. So they have been working with instrument designers all around the world. They run a competition, and it's actually, I think it's running this year, for people designing new technologies to make instruments more accessible. And I collaborated with them back in 2018. They were looking for some help with a one-handed violin. Mm-hmm. And so I was assigned the project to collaborate with them and consider different ways for a one-handed violin to be made. So I spent about 6 months on this project, and the thing that was really interesting was all of the ideas I had, I would then bring to the OMI Trust. And there was one member of the OMI Trust, Rachel Wolfson, who was meeting with me and is really very kind of integral to this community of one-handed musicians. And so she really knows the kind of access needs of this community. And I was saying, how about note selection with your feet, and she would say yes, but a lot of people who have an upper limb disability also have a leg disability. For example, they may have hemiplegia, which is paralysis of one whole side of the body. So this is something that I think is really interesting, is that I don't have an upper limb disability, right? But that's why I wouldn't go into a project like this without collaborating with the community. Mm-hmm. And so I think, first of all, yes, musical instruments, they don't consider all the possible musicians who may want to be playing those instruments. Obviously, a lot of these orchestral instruments have been designed hundreds of years ago, and we're moving so far in accessibility now. But it is really important to include disabled people in the conversation, in the design process, collaboratively design. And so through that process, we came up with the concept of the one-handed violin, which you bow the string. And the reason that we retained the bow as the controlling arm is because violinists get so much expression out of the bow, whereas there is some expression in the selection of the tones, and you can do vibrato and things like that, glissando, but we thought that there's so much more expression in the bow, and so having to only choose one hand, that was the hand that we chose. And then to select the notes, I came up with the idea of a microphone that sits on your neck, and so the performer can hum the note that they want to play. They bow the string, and then the string is pitch shifted to match the note that is hummed by the performer. And there isn't latency because the way that the pitch shifting works is it's an electric violin. The signal goes into a microcomputer that's embedded inside the violin. It runs some code that pitch shifts. It recognizes the tone that's sung by the performer. It pitch shifts the string, the bowed string tone to match that pitch, and then it outputs it in a speaker, out of a speaker that's embedded in the violin. So then that masks the original
the sound that's coming from the bow line.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, the latency for doing that is under 10 milliseconds. So that's under what humans can perceive in terms of latency. The issue with this is that you can still hear the performer hum. So it's not a perfect one-handed violin concept, but it was a pretty interesting project to work on. And then I made a one-handed stand. So in that picture, you can see the stand clips on to what I have there, which is some kind of road case. But I also made a vest where you could have that stand attached to the front of you and have it come up.
Oh, fantastic.
So that way you could be wearing the violin so that you wouldn't need to have it on your shoulder and use your chin to rest and things like that. You could be wearing it and bowing it that way. So there were two different kind of modes for the stand. And it does work. There's some videos online of it working. But the whole technology of the violin, I didn't come up with that technology. I just came up with the kind of concept and the kind of code that pitch shifts it, because the violin with the embedded speaker, that's a different augmented instrument that already exists. It's called the Svompolin, and it's designed by Laurel Pardue. And she has done a lot of work with that instrument in terms of making the violin more accessible for new players. So that instrument, having the embedded microcontroller, having the embedded speaker and masking the strings, it means that you can have embedded audio effects in the instrument. And so you can change kind of delays or reverbs or all kinds of effects, any kind of effect that you could say put in a guitar pedal or have a digital effect, or you could even make it play a synth sound or something. But what her vision for that is to sort of have amounts of auto-tune so that newer beginners can really get on with playing the violin without having to spend, years.
Like perfecting your sound, you can get close enough and be able to develop all the muscles and the intuition.
Exactly. And then you can step back the auto-tune little by little and then work into, because the violin is such a difficult instrument, you have to tune your, get your hearing into tune. You have to use the bowing hand, you have to use the other hand for playing the strings. And it's just so much for a new player. So that's what the Svompolin is designed for. And then building on that was the one-handed violin.
So, yeah, so to jump on that, your design there is the interaction design to make it more accessible.
Yeah.
So you talked about working with people with the disability. So how did that process go about when you were creating this interactive mode?
Well, it was only a 6-month placement, so I didn't actually bring in any one-handed violin players to play with it, but I did bring it to the OMI conference, and there were one-handed musicians there and did play it, and they said it was working well for them. So I think if this were a project that would be trying to continue it and then kind of bring it to market or something, yeah, that would be really important to have some professional one-handed violin players to really feed back and bring their knowledge of how to best be working and navigating a world with one hand, into the design space. Obviously, I don't have that knowledge. I'm not the expert in that. So that's where that collaborative design would come into place. But knowing that it was just a short placement, I was working with Rachel from the OMI Trust to represent that community.
So let's go further back into your history then.
Okay.
So this was you working with the OMI Trust, you said 2018?
Yeah.
How did you get into that kind of space of musical instrument design and thinking in this sort of way about accessibility within the instrument space?
Yeah. So at that point, I was in the beginning year of my PhD. So the reason I wanted to do a PhD in instrument design is that I had wanted to design instruments for many years, but I don't really learn that well on my own. I tried to learn things online. I ordered a microcomputer and I tried to code it myself and things like that, but I didn't really have anyone around me who could say, hey, this is how you get yourself out of that issue you're having and things. So I ended up joining the Augmented Instruments Lab at Queen Mary to do my PhD in instrument design so that I could be around a community of makers and learn instrument design and also research musical instruments. And so in the first year of that PhD program was a placement with an organisation. So really that was part of the PhD. Although it had nothing really to do with my PhD topic, it was a part of the formative year of the PhD.
So was your master's then like much more focused on producing music and like expressing yourself in that way rather than making stuff that then allows you to express yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did the master's with the intention of becoming a better music producer, and I created the album The Sampler is a Time Machine while I was doing my master's. And so, yeah, I played every instrument on that and composed it. And I was trying to mix it myself, but I really just kept spiraling in circles.
What's the difference in skill set there between producing and mixing?
I think, well, these days I just don't even try to mix. And that was the last thing I tried to mix myself. And the main thing I would say is me as a creator, it's a different mind that needs to kind of lock it down and then say, I'm only mixing now. When I tried to mix my album, I just kept thinking, oh no, now I need to change that part. Now I need to change that part. So I just kept bouncing myself back into the producer phase or the composer phase.
Yeah.
And so now when I finish an album, I just kind of bounce out the stems and send it to Francine Perry and I go, mix this. That's who mixed that album and also mixed Sweat Like Caramel.
Great. Both good albums. I've listened to them quite a lot this week in preparation. How many instruments do you play then, not including your own?
Okay, because I was going to say, well, that just keeps growing. Started out playing the piano and trumpet. They're the only instruments that I actually received lessons on. Bought a bass to join bands and things as a teenager. Self-taught myself electric guitar, and then having been taught piano, I just pick up synths and other things. And then I've picked up programming, drums and DAWs, and then building other random instruments.
Yeah, I guess it all compounds upon itself. And yeah, you've managed to make like some fantastic music with that. So how does your relationship with like the musical instrument as an object, or in some cases as like an entire set, in the case of Chaos Bells or Prism Bells, you've talked about wanting to explore the relationship between the instrument and embodied performance. So going back to Chaos Bells, if I can find the image again, there's something like really intuitive about these sorts of instruments, like the percussive element to them, and then also like a very responsive sound that comes out, which is it purely digital? Is there any like acoustic pickup from inside the tubes?
No, it's totally digital, the sound.
So yeah, what elements of an instrument then are important to your design philosophy for the types of things that you want to play?
It depends which instrument I'm designing, but Chaos Bells was designed with the intention of building a digital instrument that was larger than the performer's body. And that comes from, I've been getting on stages for the last 15 years as a solo electronic music performer. So I started out that project really wanting to make very electronic music, but not really knowing how to do that live and not really kind of knowing where to look for examples of anyone else doing that. And so I started to design my own way of performing live, and it went through all these iterations from, okay, I've got a guitar and a looper pedal and I've got a drum pad, or a sampler, and then, I got rid of the guitar and got a 4-track tape machine, and would mess with that, and also a sampler. Or at one point I was doing tape loops live with like a synth and a drum machine to do it live as like weird live, like wacky techno. So I went through all of these different iterations, and every iteration it just felt really constrained behind a table. And way back I used to be in bands and play bass and just kind of jump around and use my whole body, and I really miss that on stage as an electronic musician. And so I thought, where is the instrument that's digital that you can really throw your body into, and what does using your body bring to electronic music performance? And so the point of this instrument is that it's so big, you do have to use your body to play it. You have to choose which tones to play because you can't play them all at once. It's 2 meters wide. So although there was a performer, Kunal Singha, he made up this performance move where he knelt in front. This was for the V&A actually. I commissioned him to do some performances at that installation, and he practiced with cowbells for about a year. He was like, he's probably the performer who knows that instrument the best because he came to my studio and would play that instrument all the time. He came up with this way of playing it where he knelt down in front of it and spread his arms out like an eagle and then kind of raised all of the bottom tier notes at once, and then they all drone when you tilt them like that. So that's probably the most of the tones that have been played at once, although that's all the ones at the bottom, so you wouldn't be able to play all the ones at the top as well. But yeah, so the point of the instrument is for it to require physical kind of gestures and it being larger than you. It therefore creates different music because if it all fit underneath your hands, you wouldn't have to make such choices. And so that's why also you can play it percussively, but you can also drone the instrument by tilting it. And it has very sensitive sound synthesis. So the sound changes depending how hard you hit it or the angle of the drone. And if you tilt it too far, it goes into chaos mode, which is kind of chaos mode? Sounds like white noise. What's happening then is the system has just like too much energy in it. And once you let go of that, it kind of reverses out of the chaos mode into like a tone and then goes quiet again. So
when you say the system has too much energy in it, what's happening on the digital level? Is the instrument like self-interactive in that way, whereby if you're playing something over here, for instance, that's going to affect how something down here is working?
It may do, but not in the way that you're probably thinking. It's more physical. So in each of those pipes is an accelerometer. So that's a sensor that measures the tilt. So basically, in your phone, the way that it can tell the orientation of whether it's up or sideways, that's an accelerometer. So what I did is I set it to recognize just the y-axis, so forwards and backwards swinging, okay? And then I assigned that angle to drive a physical modeling algorithm, which is essentially the coded kind of emulation of an electric guitar string.
Okay.
So when you drone it, it's almost like a digital electric guitar droning. And that means when you hit it with a mallet or your hands, it is swinging. So you get this kind of bell-like tone because it's like hitting it.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you drone it, you tilt it out, it'll drone longer because it's staying at that angle. So the energy, you asked me about the energy. So essentially when you have it at the angle, it's letting more and more into that. It's like driving harder and harder and harder that string synthesis.
Okay, yeah.
And so there is a point where you get like over 100, and that's where it goes kind of to white noise. Well, I don't think you could actually do it in the physical domain.
Yeah.
It'd be like, imagine getting an EBO and it's vibrating so hard that it just like goes on fire or something. Like
that'd be great. You should try that on stage. Set fire to your one-handed violin. How do you decide what sorts of sounds? So you talk about like synthesized electric guitar there, especially like, because that's not like the first thing you might, or that might come to mind when like an instrument is called chaos bells is probably something more metallic, more bell sounding. But like, how do you decide and develop with a digital instrument where those kind of sounds come from and how they're driven and the origins or not of them?
Yeah. So I did make it more bell sounding in the higher register. So I added more harmonics into that to make it kind of a more bell-like, kind of frail kind of sound. And then the bass register is a more clear kind of bass tone. The reason I did that, well, a couple of reasons. One is I thought it sounded cool, but the other reason is that before building this massive digital instrument, I interviewed 7 performers of large acoustic instruments. So I interviewed a tuba player, an organ player, a player of the Jill. So that's a very large, almost xylophone style instrument, but it's from Africa and it's performed percussively. Interviewed a contrabassoon player, contrabass flute. Yeah, so 7 players of very large acoustic instruments, because it was interesting that there are really large acoustic instruments, but in the digital world, we don't really have a culture of large instruments. In fact, it's like instrument companies are just trying to make synths smaller and smaller and smaller. Like, let's make it fit on the desktop. Oh, let's make it fit on your watch. Let's make it fit on your ring. Like, do you know what I mean? And meanwhile, I was thinking, but I want to actually like kind of move my body on stage and play the music with my body. So I interviewed all of these performers who have a professional and creative practice based on their large instruments. And I wanted to know what is so special about those acoustic instruments. And so through interviewing them, I found out a lot of things about large acoustic instruments, and I put those ideas into the design of this instrument. And one of the things I found out is that large woodwind instruments have a very clear lower end sound, and that's why they're designed. They have a very large air chamber and it lets this very clear bass tone in, and that's why actually they're newer designed instruments. The contrabass flute, the contrabassoon, they're actually only decades old rather than like, you know, other orchestral instruments which are centuries old. So the thing with those instruments is if you try to play in the really upper registers, that's not what they're designed for. So the sound is very frail, and they described it as alien, you know, and it's not a clear tone. So if you get on the contrabass flute and you play in the higher register, which is where a concert flute might be, it's not going to sound like a concert flute. It's going to sound like a really like strangely creepy. It'll still be the same tone, but the timbre is different. And so that's what I wanted to do with this instrument, is put more of a stranger timbre into that higher register.
That's really interesting. Like trying to, because as a digital instrument, you have like so much control over that kind of timbre, and then to build into your system that like emulating where a traditional instrument designer imagining this instrument is going to play more classical music, like would see it failing. You're like trying to bring those so that they're to the fore.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the thing is that, you would never be like, who wants to play this higher register part? I'll give it to the contrabass flute. You'd say, I'll give it to the concert flute or the piccolo. But actually, the contrabass flute player would play the contrabass flute because not only do they get those deep tones, they also get those really quirky high-end tones. And so that is something that they can't do with the concert flute. So that means these large instruments have a special quality that the other instruments don't have. It's not like just adding an octave pedal or something.
Yeah.
And so that makes them have a real special position as an instrument. They have something special. So I wanted to make these large instruments have something special that smaller instruments didn't consider as the sound design.
And on stage, they're like unmissably taking up space. Like there's something like quite interestingly overwhelming about how it will engulf a performer, and it sort of makes that performance like a dance, really, because like as you've illustrated, like movement is so much a part of like having to be physically involved in how this instrument like makes those sounds. Are you going to go bigger? Would you, or is this your sort of ideal size?
Yeah, I don't know where I'm going. Yeah. Like, I just kind of have ideas and try them out. So, yeah, I'd love to go bigger. I'm trying to figure out ways to make them compact smaller, like fold down smaller so that I can go bigger. And right now my focus is looking at very sustainable materials. So with the Catastrophone, I was exploring how to make a large instrument out of found materials and recycled materials and sustainable materials. Again, it was really considering how instrument design companies that are focused on digital instruments like synths, drum machines, they use a lot of plastics. And so I wanted to think about how to build an instrument that is large but uses sustainable materials. So I was playing with paper, and I ended up collaging paper to make it kind of thick enough to be able to be played percussively. And the paper that I had was cat pictures, because I had like a cat encyclopedia in my studio. And so, yeah, I took it out to a concert and was, I had a performer with me playing it. Liz, Melina, Nieto. She has so many names. Godoy. I think I got them all. Okay. And so she performed it, and I said I was like playing my stuff with samplers and stuff. It was the Sweat Like Caramel music. And so she was playing parts she'd written with the Catastrophone alongside me playing the Sweat Like Caramel stuff. I said to the audience, here's the new instrument, but I don't know what to call it. And then Agat Max, who is, people around London know her, she's an experimental musician, came up and said, you've got to call it the Catastrophone.
It's a fantastic name. So it's good to know that that's a kind of crowdsourced thing. A question I had about it, the paper, cardboard, the feedback response of playing it must be very different from the PVC. And like, how did that come into informing that kind of sound that you wanted out of it? How does that like interface or different methods of percussive interface in these two instruments particularly affect the way in which you, I was going to say visualize, but like audio, what's the...
Right. So the Catastrophone, I hook it up to a synth and I'm essentially playing the synth with this physical oversized interface. The reason I hooked it up to a synth was that I just wanted a sound that I would use on my albums. So my albums I've made using a lot of different synths and drum machines. I haven't made an album with Chaos Bells, so although I would like to, I thought, all right, why don't I make an instrument that sounds more like my sound palette of my albums and see what that is like, because then having it on stage with me, it sort of sits in the sound world a bit more. I've toured with Chaos Bells as well, and that adds something different to the show. It's a completely different sound that wasn't on the album and things. But, you know, when I love to play with musicians improvising along with me, because I'm improvising my albums out of like a crazy grid of stems of the whole different parts of the album and stuff. So I'm like live remixing it, which means I can take any turn or kind of like change the pitch, change the tempo, everything, kind of go into weird sound collagey bits and then come back out in one of the songs. And that means there's a lot of space for the performers to kind of add these strange sounds from Chaos Bells. But yeah, I've also done a few shows with the Catastrophone, which is more of a synth sound. And so, yeah, it just brings something different by having it be more of an electronic music sound.
Have you noticed any like difference in the way that audiences have reacted since you've started introducing these instruments into your live performances?
I don't think so, but, you know, it's quite interesting. Sometimes you'll walk through the crowd while it's on the stage, but before you've played and no one's really sure what it is. And I went to Belfast and I took Chaos Bells there, and it didn't fit on the stage area, so it had to kind of be
like amongst
on the
audience.
side. Yeah, it had to be on the side of the dance floor, and that was fine. But of course, it was like part of the dance floor while people were watching other artists. And at one point, someone hung their bag on it, which I just thought was really funny. And then later they were like, "Oh my God, it's part of the show!" Like, but yeah,
and you're like, "Well, your bag is now connected to a synth." Yeah, I'd recommend anyone to watch your set from Eclectic with Catastrophone. I watched that, very, very entertaining. Have you got any plans to bring all of your instruments together into a live performance or some kind of, because so we've covered only 3 of them so far, but you've got a few more as well. Have you thought about trying to orchestrate them?
Yeah, I'm working on putting together a gallery show that will have all the instruments, and then they can be, you know, performed or people can try them out. And yeah, that won't necessarily be just a solo show for me.
Yeah.
There'll be other people there. But yeah, it's tough getting them all in the same place. You need a slightly large room. Yeah. But that is a goal, absolutely.
Do you so I have these 2 here, this is Prism Bells.
Yeah.
So this looks like it's just an earlier iteration of what becomes Chaos Bells. Is that the case, or do you still see them as very different things?
They're different things. They have different sensors inside. Mm-hmm. They work differently. They've got different code. But that was, so I knew I wanted to build an instrument that was large, and I had that show at Islington Assembly Hall booked in my calendar, and I thought, you know, I would love to bring a giant instrument to that show. Yeah. And so I whipped that up because I wasn't ready to have Chaos Bells. So that was where I was at with the circuitry and everything. And then it, you know, got designed into Chaos Bells. But that is very different in terms of how it works.
So you mentioned the circuitry, and so microelectronics and the Bella platform.
Yeah.
I believe they're like really commonly used within the instruments that you've made. So how do you interact with the tech whilst you're designing it? Is it something that do you work outwardly from like the circuit board and say like, here's a way that I can introduce sound through this thing? Or are you looking at, I have an interaction, so I want to stroke cats on cardboard, and then trying to create a connective tissue with the electronics from that?
It's sort of like you think up one thing and then you multiply it to make it bigger. Mm-hmm. So, each, like the Catastrophone is, quite large. I think it also is 2 meters wide and 2 meters tall, but it really is just 12 performance pads. So you could do that very small, but it's just very big. So the way I design these is, you just have to start with one thing to test if that even works. You wouldn't build the whole thing without knowing that one thing worked.
So a question that we hope to be like a continuous question that we'll ask everyone, very broad. What is technology?
Yeah, so I think technology is something that extends beyond the human body to be something that helps us get things done.
So would you like an augmentation, or do you consider it to be part of you once you're using it?
Oh, well, now we're getting to philosophy. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, it depends how you approach it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, where I rode my bicycle here, like that definitely feels like a part of me, but sitting on the bus, I don't really have any control over the way that's going. So I think it has to do with your levels of control of that technology.
So agency within the system.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way when you're using the microelectronics or like the Bella platform now? Is that is that a part of your brain that you feel that you've not necessarily fully understand to its greatest extent, but like that it is actually now sort of just part of your thinking methodology?
So that is kind of like, how you have the conscious and the unconscious brain. So that's like the unconscious. That's just working along in the background. Consciously, you're performing the interface, Yeah. So I don't, I sit and code that and, of course I'm tweaking it throughout the iterative process of designing an instrument. But once I'm playing the instrument, I'm not thinking about what the Bella is doing at all. I'm just kind of playing the sound as if I were playing an acoustic instrument.
So what other technologies are part of your workflow within that kind of either in the design itself or also in the playing and performing?
So what technologies do I use?
Yeah.
I often play Ableton Push. I used to use the Octatrack sampler, but I was getting too frustrated with how long it takes to put samples onto it. Whereas with Ableton Live, you can just kind of drag and drop samples. It's really fast. So when I play, I like to kind of change my set all of the time. Like no two shows would be the same set. So I really like that flexibility to kind of change what the samples are and everything. So I've been using Push lately and just instruments that I make. But I've previously used a lot of the Electron synths and drum machines. And I've previously had some Roland drum machines, but they didn't kind of work for me for various reasons. One broke on tour once, which was really disappointing.
Oh, that's not good to hear.
The good thing about making your own instrument is you know how to fix it.
Yes, 100%. What is it about an instrument that you find that excites you or delights you, that you get the right kind of feedback from when you're either writing or performing?
It's always fun when the instrument does something that you don't expect.
Mm-hmm.
And that does happen. And also when someone else plays it, you don't know what they're going to play, and you can be really surprised, and they can play it in ways that you hadn't even imagined when you designed it. So that's probably my favorite part.
Have you got an example of like how someone has surprised you with your own instrument?
Yeah. So the Chaos Bells, I designed them like a little bit. So that photo of Prison Bell, that was in September 2019. And then through, 2020, lockdown 2021, I was working on Chaos Bells. And then the study I did with 10 musicians performing it was in, I want to say, September-ish of 2021. So it's been now about 3 years that this instrument has kind of existed. And I took it out to Great Exhibition Road Festival 2 weekends ago, and some musicians from the Royal College of Music, who are kind of like outstanding improvisers, came and played a concert with that, the magnetic resonator piano, and there was a saxophone and a cello, and they had this 4-piece band. And so the person who was improvising with Chaos Bells is a hand percussionist, and his name is Guy Corti. And there were things that he was doing that I had never seen done before with this instrument. He realized that you can make it have vibrato by kind of wobbling this support beam here that holds up the pendulums, by bouncing it while pulling a pendulum out to drone it. It was creating vibrato. Wow. And I didn't even know. I've never seen any performer do that before. So there's always moments where you don't know what this system is capable of until somebody comes along and has an idea.
Do instances like that make you feel differently about it as a system? Like, has it, when you first performed with it, did it feel like really, really new, or maybe even like a child that you were having to like show off for the first time? And then has it like matured? Do you feel that you understand ways in which people more generally will use it as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting instrument for so many different reasons, because it sort of looks like tubular bells or wind chimes or something, but it doesn't sound like that. And so what it means is that it's a bit of a blank slate, like what people want to get out of it, they can. So someone who is a cello player will kind of play it maybe more like a cello and make it drone, whereas someone who is a percussionist, like Andrew Booker, he's actually the percussionist who played the Catastrophone in that eclectic concert, and he's also played, he's played various shows with me, but he also used the Chaos Bells in the online concert I did with 10 musicians playing the Chaos Bells. And so he's a drummer and a hand percussionist as well. And so he will play it in a very percussive kind of way, like a tuned percussion instrument.
Do you have an example of a technology that once you tried to introduce it into your workflow, so maybe it's a broken drum machine, but that like you were excited for, that you then found to be disappointing once you'd actually understood it and got your hands on it?
I'm always trying to introduce things into my workflow, but it's not necessarily like if I move on from a technology, it might not be because I'm disappointed. It might be that I really like bringing something new into the mix to get newer ideas. So all of my albums, I'll bring a different kind of synth in, And even if I love that synth, I won't use it on the next one because I'll try to just use the one synth for all of the tracks. And by, the 7th or 8th track, you're like, I want to use it in a different way. And you just find like more and more and more different ways to use it. So rather than using 8 different synths for 8 different tracks, you're kind of finding 8 different ways to use the same synth. So I feel like I'm like rinsing these instruments, trying to get as much out of them as I can. And then if I go, a year later, want to make another album, I'll want something new to kind of go through that process with. So I've kind of done that with a lot of different drum machines or samplers. Like I definitely did that with the Octatrack. And yeah, the point that I got to with the Octatrack, as I said, was it just took way too long to program what I wanted to do. And it's really, really robust in so many ways and it's an amazing instrument, but I just kind of want to move faster than I can with it in terms of making it a flexible, different set all of the time. So, as long as I can make what I want to make, I'm generally not that disappointed by technology.
So for you, is an album, is it the product of exploring a given like central instrument or set of instruments that do you consider it to be like kind of like a project within which you're trying to see how far you can push something?
Yeah, it's like what are the central ideas I'm working on at that moment, and it wouldn't necessarily just be an instrument, it might just be approaches and ideas.
Have you got another album in the works, or second part of that, what is the writing process for creating a body of work in that medium, in that way?
So the way I did Sweat Like Caramel is I just said to myself, I'm just going to go to the studio and have fun. And that kind of turned into me playing with the reel-to-reel tape machine. And then I was trying to use the reel-to-reel tape machine in all different ways. Like I was sampling tapes and cutting tapes and making tape loops and all kinds of things. So basically I just said, for 3 days a week, for 3 months, I'm going to play in my studio with a tape machine. I know I'm going to end up with some songs. That will be my album. And that's how I did that. But yeah, I don't have a project like that in the works right now. At the moment, I'm trying to finish off some more instruments, and I really want to make some music with these instruments that I've designed because for starters, because Chaos Spells was part of my PhD, I couldn't kind of show it and make music with it until after my PhD, because the way the studies ran is that the musicians had to not know about this instrument until I showed it to them in a specific way. So I couldn't, show online the building of it and me playing and things like that. So at that time, I was making Sweat Like Caramel as well. So I haven't kind of gotten now to the point where I am ready to make an album. But when I do, I want to do it with these instruments because I haven't made original music to release with these instruments yet. And so I think next I will maybe, rather than exploring other instruments, I might explore these instruments and take them as far as they can go.
How, bringing it back, because what you just said made me think, what sorts of, what is a PhD in this sort of topic like, being like a performative field, but also like research into design around instruments? How did your, can you go into more detail about how that structure and those limitations about showing it kind of helped you develop or affected the way in which you would otherwise act with something like this? Yeah,
so when I started the PhD and had the idea to build large instruments and explore what does the size of the instrument bring to the music that's being made, that's when I was told, go out and interview people who play large acoustic instruments, because I was having ideas for what these large instruments might be, and I was being asked, like, why would you have those ideas? Why should this instrument sound like that? And I couldn't really answer that question. So going out and putting all those extra steps into the research, paid off in the design of the instrument, because it's a completely different instrument than it would have been, and it's got so many ideas built into it because of all those extra steps. So that part of me talking to the large acoustic instrument performers, that was a whole study in itself. That's a whole chapter of my PhD. And then I was prototyping this instrument. And then while I was prototyping and building this instrument, I was also kind of designing how it would look. So I had to read a lot of instrument design papers and studies and understand how to build the studies and what I wanted to get out of them. And so in that process, the study was designed to include moments where the performers play the instrument without being shown how to play it and be introduced to the instrument. There was a study that I ran where I showed the instrument to performers and I asked them to play it with the sound off just to see how they would play it. And I asked them to imagine what it would sound like and tell me about that. And so they had to make performances where it had no sound. And then I let them hear what it sounds like, but I didn't let them see how I made that sound.
Yeah.
And then I asked them again to make a performance. Now they knew how it sounded. And then finally I said, okay, I've turned it on. Now you can play it. And so through that process, that was looking at, what would they have done just because it's physically large, and how does the sound impact what they've done now that the sound is turned on, and also what did they think it would sound like just because of the way it looks, and how did that impact what their ideas were for performing and things like that. And
were there any trends that came through from what people had imagined it would sound like?
Yeah, most of them thought it might sound metallic, might sound metal, might sound, someone said a squeaky gate, wind chimes or, but and that's kind of interesting because we have these preconceived ideas before we even play an instrument, and but what was interesting was the next study was, so building on that study was a whole other study where 10 performers spent 4 different sessions with the instrument, and they weren't told how to play the instrument, but they were told to make all kinds of compositions. So one day it'd be like, make a composition where you're focusing on rhythm, and then the other one might be like, make a composition where you're focusing on melody. And so with the different focus, it was trying to just get them to kind of, it's like almost priming them to sort of make them talk about different aspects of the instrument. So all of these studies ended with interviews with the participants. And so through those interviews, it was kind of, you could gain a lot of insight into what they think about the instrument and what is special, I guess, about having a large instrument, because they were saying things that stood out to them that they couldn't do with other instruments and things like that. And then, so I analysed the performances, the notes that they played, like I did a motivic analysis on kind of different motives of the compositions. And I also analysed the interviews and pulled out themes. And that was what I wrote up as my PhD.
Is the PhD experience one that you would recommend?
It was great for me. I loved it. It was, I always say it was the best decision I made in my life. I think there's something kind of great about discovering knowledge, and, you're not allowed to submit a PhD if we already know what's in it. The PhD is supposed to be something that humans don't know yet, which is why they're always so obscure. And the strangest titles. Like I love reading PhD titles because they're so specific.
Yeah.
And they're such a tiny increment more than
What was
we
the
know
title
yet.
of yours?
It was Go Large, the Impact of Size on Gestural Digital Musical Instrument Design.
I mean, that's quite broad versus what you're insinuating some others are. Like, so you've added a chunk of knowledge, not just a small bit. So yeah, we're coming towards the end of our time. And there's a couple more instruments that I've seen that you've created before. So this one is Pet Cemetery. Can you? No, not Pet Cemetery.
It's Instrument Cemetery.
I've got Stephen King in my head.
No, but it's named after that.
I think that's probably why I have it in my head. I've read the bio. Can you tell us about Instrument Cemetery, please?
So this was a project that I created in 2019, but I'm continuing this series now that I have time, now that I finished my PhD, I have time to build a series out of it. So the concept is that I was exploring why are digital instruments so often made of plastics, and if you go through a market, you'll see all these kind of broken Casio keyboards and often like broken plastic toy instruments, they just end up in landfill.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite depressing to think about that in a climate crisis. Yet you will often walk through a marketplace and see a broken guitar or a broken harp. You know, this Instrument Cemetery, which is number one, it has this kind of harp. I think it's called a cantel. It's kind of like a triangular wooden instrument. And when I bought it, it was kind of a bit broken, but yeah, it was just a triangle shape. The idea was that why are acoustic instruments kind of made of more sustainable materials, and when they're broken, people still recognize them as a beautiful object, and they really try not to put it in landfill. Even if it's broken, you'll see it on a shelf somewhere or someone will try to repair it. And yet these plastic digital instruments, people don't value them, and nobody tries to fix them, and they just end up in the trash. So I wanted to take these acoustic instruments that were broken. I bought them at Deptford Market and I hacked them up and Frankenstein them together. And I wanted to create a new instrument with a new personality. So in Pet Cemetery, the pets die. They get buried in the pet cemetery and then they come back to life with a really evil personality. So I wanted to create instruments where these instruments have died, but I'm bringing them back with a really crazy personality. So this one glows in UV light. It has UV strings, and it has also an embedded microcontroller. So when you shake it, it will scramble the effects in it. It's got flanger, delay, reverb, chorus. And so then when you shake it, it scrambles the effect settings. And then when you hold it still, it snaps onto whatever the last setting was. And then you can play it. It sounds quite wild. So that's, another instrument that kind of interrogates the materials that the music industry is using for making digital instruments. The thing about digital instruments is they could be made with anything. It's the sensor and the code that makes the sound. So there's no reason why they have to be plastic. And that's why I was exploring also with Catastrophone, could they be made of paper? So I'm continuing this series and I'll see where I get to. But the idea is I find broken instruments and I give them a new life.
Have you got your own graveyard of rescued instruments from Deptford Yard?
Yeah, I've been collecting a few, yeah.
What are there any highlights that you can tell us that you've got ideas about how you're going to bring them back to life?
Not yet. It's sort of a collage. Like you have to just put together the ones that you find. So I've got a few going on, but I need to hack them together. I'm not sure how they'll all fit together. You have to put the puzzle together in the right time. It's not ready yet. I just need to bury them a little longer.
Let me ask about this last one then. Chandelier.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is an incredibly charming instrument in how it drones, but also has the percussive tap that controls the lighting. When was this in your musical instrument journey, and where is it now?
That was the first instrument I made. Again, I got a secondhand chandelier, and it wasn't working, so. It still had the wiring through it, actually. I was trying to remember the other day, how did I get the wires all the way through? And then I remembered, oh, no, it was already wired. So I added the lights and I added a sensor in it so that you can swing the chandelier and it makes a nice droney sound. Kind of sounds like the electricity going through. It's a bit pitched, and you can also hit it percussively. And that was a cool little experiment. And in a way, it is a little precursor to the chaos bells.
I mean, I guess everything informs each other, right?
Yeah.
What you learn becomes into the next project. Do you have any shows coming up or planning for any shows in the future aside? I mean, you mentioned a gallery show that you'd like to do with your collection, your whole orchestra.
I don't have any dates for anything coming up. I am at the moment just working on some new work. Yeah, the new Instrument Cemetery series. Okay. But things seem to pop into my calendar. Yeah. So
where can people find you so that they can keep on track of when you are playing somewhere?
On my website. So
liamice.com.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I do have one question. How would you describe your musical style?
Oh, I don't know. I guess it's experimental pop, but once you add in these instruments, that's quite heavy on the experimental.
Yeah. It's like research pop.
I think experimental says it's like you're honestly going into it as I don't know what the outcome will be.
Yeah.
So I'm doing all these experiments, and then I do have extreme pop sensibilities. So it does come out for me as, somewhere between electronic dance music and kind of pop.
Do you have any particular heroes that you think influenced that style?
Yeah, I love Yellow Magic Orchestra. The instrument stuff, I mean, the first show I ever saw live was Boredoms. So they've always been making kind of weird instruments. And so although they're a lot more noise than the stuff I do, I think that openness to be quite flexible with, everything doesn't have to fit into a pop structure. It can just be quite chaotic. I kind of bring that idea into the pop realm. It is definitely outside of pop, though. It's not anywhere near anything mainstream would want associated with them.
Wow. And then finally, who would you recommend to be on this podcast if you could have a dream guest?
Sarah Anglis.
Who's she? What does she do?
Sarah Anglis makes all kinds of instruments and has also made an opera and has a very eclectic career of experimenting in music technologies.
Cool. Wow.
And is a hero of mine.
Wonderful. Sarah Anglis forever. And Dr. Lia Mice, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.